Manfred and Marísia von Richthofen seemed to have built the perfect life. An elegant home, successful careers, and two children who wanted for nothing. But in 1999, when their daughter Suzane met Daniel Cravinhos, that image began to fracture. Over the next 3 years, their relationship deepened against her parents' wishes, drawing in Daniel's brother, Christian, and setting in motion a plan as cold as it was calculated. On the night of October 31st, 2002, the von Richthofen mansion became the scene of one of Brazil's most shocking crimes. A crime that would grip the country, dominate headlines, and leave a family's name forever changed. What happened that night? And how did it come to this? This is the chilling case of Suzanne Richthofen. The von Richthofen name carried a long, distinguished history, tied to an aristocratic German lineage that had produced explorers, diplomats, aviators, and scholars. Among them were Ferdinand von Richthofen, the 19th century geographer who mapped China, Oswald, a diplomat, Elsa, a political scientist, and Frida, a philosopher. Perhaps most famous of all was Manfred von Richthofen, the Red Baron, whose legend as a World War I flying ace endured for generations. Manfred Albert von Richthofen, born in Erbach, Germany in 1953, carried that name to Brazil. While the family connection to the Red Baron was disputed by relatives in Europe, the heritage and its expectations remained. His branch of the family, by his own account, had lost much of its wealth and influence in the political and economic upheaval that followed 2 world wars. In the 1970s, while studying engineering at the University of Sao Paulo, Manfred met Marísia Abdallah, a warm and charismatic medical student of Italian and Lebanese descent. She had grown up in the countryside of Sao Paulo state, shaped by the close-knit ties of a family whose roots ran deep in local commerce and community life. The two married, moved to Germany for further studies, and returned to Brazil to build a comfortable, successful life together. Manfred rose through the ranks to become engineering director at DERSA, overseeing major infrastructure projects like the Rodoano Mario Covas Expressway. Marísia established a thriving psychiatric practice. Together, they earned well, their combined income and assets placing them among the well-to-do of Sao Paulo. Their first child, Suzane, was born in 1983, followed by Andreas in 1987. The family settled into a home in the upscale Brooklyn neighborhood where they lived for nearly 15 years. Neighbors remembered them as polite, respectable, and close-knit, a family that seemed to have every advantage. Even after moving out of that house in 2000, they returned regularly to collect mail, tend the yard, and keep the property in order, maintaining the appearance of stability and warmth that had long defined them. By 2000, the Richthofens had moved out of that house, but they kept it, returning regularly to tend the yard and collect mail. The harmony began to crack when Suzanne started dating Daniel Cravinhos, a young man from a far different world. Manfred and Marísia disapproved. Their disapproval would grow into open conflict, a slow-burn family tension that, unknown to those around them, was heading toward something far darker than anyone could have imagined. In their quiet residential village, the Cravinhos family was a fixture. Neighbors called them the Loud family, not for arguments, but for the constant hum of engines and the whir of model airplanes drifting through the air on weekends. Estrogildo and Nadia had built their life there, raising 3 sons. Marco, the eldest, married young and helped support his parents. Christian, the middle child, was restless, drawn to speed, motocross tracks, and parachuting jumps. Daniel, the youngest, was different. Polite, focused, and deeply devoted to the craft of aeromodeling. By his teens, he was a champion in Brazil and South America, even placing 5th in the world at a 1998 competition in Kiev. His models sold for over 1,000 reais each, and while he once tried studying law, he left after 6 months. His father, too, had a complicated tie to the legal world. Convicted in the 1970s for using a fake Brazilian Bar Association card before later working as a notary's clerk. For years, the Cravinhos home was filled with the sound of engines and propellers. It was the sound of a family's routine, carrying easily over the quiet streets. Deadly love. It began innocently enough, at least that's how it seemed. On a Sunday afternoon in August 1999, the von Richthofen family, Manfred, Marísia, Suzane, and Andreas, went for a walk in Sao Paulo's sprawling Ibirapuera Park. It was there they met Daniel Cravinhos, a young aeromodeling competitor whose hobby instantly caught Andreas's attention. The boy asked his parents if he could take lessons, and soon Daniel was visiting regularly, teaching him to build and fly the intricate planes. The friendship between Daniel and Andreas grew quickly. Daniel took him on bike rides, to model car races, and even, according to friends, played matchmaker between brother and sister. Andreas, it was said, once slipped Suzanne's note to Daniel, a quiet signal of her interest. Manfred and Marísia didn't object at first, thinking it was just a passing teenage romance. But over time, Daniel became more than just Suzane's boyfriend. He became a fixture in her life. Andreas confided in both of them, sometimes joining in their outings, which occasionally drifted into risky territory. He later told police he had hidden in the trunk of Daniel's car during a trip to a hot sheet hotel, where the couple smoked cannabis. It was Daniel, he said, who introduced him to marijuana in Villa Lobos State Park. Christian, Daniel's older brother, was also a presence, someone Andreas described as a dear friend. By the early 2000s, Manfred and Marísia's feelings towards Daniel had shifted. They saw him making only 1 or 2 planes a month to sell for about 1,400 reais, picking up extra income from parts and repairs. Christian was in and out of rehab for cocaine addiction, tangled in debts to drug dealers, and working as a police informant. The Richthofens began to fear that Daniel and his family were not a good influence on their daughter. Friends noticed changes in both Daniel and Suzane. She had lost her virginity to him at 16. Together, they smoked marijuana almost daily and experimented with ecstasy. Her once active social life narrowed until nearly everything revolved around him. At law school, they were inseparable, Daniel even tagging along on her class excursions. His bedroom at his parents' house became a shrine to their relationship. Panels covered in photos, a caricature of them together, and a pillow printed with her image resting among his stuffed animals. Manfred and Marísia eventually tried to intervene. They began pressuring Suzane to end the relationship after discovering his drug use and her slipping motivation to study. She responded with lies and secrecy, telling them she was staying with friends when she was really spending the night with Daniel. Friends admitted covering for her, until one April night in 2002 when Marísia phoned a supposed friend and learned Suzane wasn't there. The confrontation that followed ended with Suzane admitting she'd spent the night in a hotel with Daniel. That was the moment her parents banned the relationship outright. The ban only deepened the rift. Once close to her mother, Suzane now avoided her parents and fought with them whenever she came home with Daniel. In July, while her parents were away for a month, she spent nearly all her time with him. When they returned, she asked for an apartment so she could live with her boyfriend. Manfred refused. He told her to finish her education first, then she could choose her life. That refusal planted the seed that would grow into something darker. There were public flashes of the tension to come. In September 2002, police were called to break up a late-night argument at a house in Campo Belo. They found Manfred at the gate in shorts and slippers, facing off with Daniel, while Suzane tried to calm them. It wasn't the first time. 2 similar incidents had been reported in May and June. That night, tempers simmered into quiet threats. Manfred told an officer, "One of these days, I'm going to beat this kid up." Daniel, in turn, said of the engineer, "I feel like beating this old man." 2 months later, Manfred and Marísia were dead. Murder in the family. In the days before the murders, the plan had already taken shape. Suzanne and the Cravinhos brothers tested the sound of a firearm, deciding it was too loud, too risky. The weapon of choice would be something quieter: iron bars. On the afternoon of October 30th, 2002, Suzanne and Daniel went over the plan for the last time. Christian, still unsure, listened as they explained the details. Daniel told him to think it over, and if he agreed, to wait at a designated street near an internet cafe. That night, Suzane would drop off Andreas there, giving him the impression she and Daniel were celebrating her upcoming birthday at a hotel, while he enjoyed the cafe and got a free pass to skip school the next day. Christian was already there when Andreas arrived. He came at 10:12 p.m., left before 11 so the boy wouldn't see him, and waited nearby. By 11:20 p.m., Suzanne and Daniel had joined him. In Daniel's Volkswagen Ghoul, the three drove to the von Richthofen mansion. Days earlier, Suzanne had disabled the alarm and surveillance cameras, ensuring their arrival would leave no trace. Around midnight, they parked in the garage. The hollow iron bars were already in the car. The brothers pulled on tights and blouses to prevent leaving hair or fibers behind. Suzanne opened the gate, went upstairs and turned on the hallway light, a silent signal. Marísia and Manfred were asleep. Downstairs, she prepared garbage bags and surgical gloves from her mother's medical supplies. Daniel moved toward Manfred, Christian toward Marísia. The attacks were brutal and fast. Manfred died instantly from the blows. Marísia woke mid-attack, tried to defend herself, and suffered 3 broken fingers. Christian later told police she begged them not to hurt her children, believing they were asleep. Her pleas ended when he pressed a towel over her mouth, then forced another down her throat, breaking a bone in her neck. When both were dead, Daniel placed Manfred's own revolver near his arm and covered his face with a towel. Marísia's body was wrapped in a garbage bag. The brothers stripped off their blood-stained clothes, placing them and the murder weapons into the bags Suzane had left on the stairs. Suzanne would later say she stayed on the first floor, sitting on the sofa, pretending to hold a phone to her ear. She claimed she no longer wanted her parents dead, but by then, she said, it was already too late. What she did do was open a leather briefcase in the house, one she knew the code to, removing cash while Daniel slashed it open with a knife to make it look like a theft. They took the equivalent of tens of thousands in reais, euros, and dollars. They opened the couple's safe, scattered jewelry on the floor, and left the revolver where it lay. The bloodied bars were washed in the swimming pool before being bagged. Christian's payment was the stolen cash and some jewelry. The couple dropped him near his grandmother's apartment, then moved to the final part of the plan, building their alibi. They drove to the Colonial Motel on Ricardo Jaffe Avenue, booking the presidential suite for around 300 reais. They ordered a Coca-Cola and a ham sandwich. Daniel even asked for an invoice, the first ever issued by the motel. The records would later show they were there from 1:36 a.m. to 2:56 a.m., while in Brooklyn, the house they had left behind was silent, the bodies of Manfred and Marísia lying upstairs in the dark. After leaving the motel in the early hours of October 31st, Suzanne and Daniel headed back to the internet cafe to collect Andreas. From there, they went to Daniel's house, where Suzanne suggested her younger brother take a ride on Daniel's scooter. It was all part of the plan. By time, keep Andreas away from the mansion until the scene was ready. Around 4 a.m., Suzanne and Andreas returned home. She acted startled when she saw the front doors open. Andreas stepped into the library, calling out for their parents. Suzanne, murmuring prayers, went into the kitchen, took a knife from a drawer, and handed it to her brother. She told him to wait outside. Then she phoned Daniel. Together with Andreas, she made repeated calls to the house line, pretending to wait for her parents to answer. At 4:09 a.m., Daniel phoned the police. His voice was urgent but measured. He was parked outside his girlfriend's house, he said, and suspected a robbery was in progress. Could a patrol car come quickly? The first officer on scene was Alexandre Paulino Boto. Years later, during the trial, he would call the murders an amateur crime. The signs, he said, were obvious: jewelry, cell phones, and a gun left in plain sight in the couple's bedroom. A thief wouldn't leave a gun on the floor. Suzanne's composure struck Boto. She asked what procedures the police would follow, an unusual question for someone whose parents might be inside. When he told her they were fine, she reacted with genuine surprise. "How?" she asked. Daniel's behavior was also odd. He immediately asked if anything had been taken, then volunteered exact figures for the cash supposedly kept in the house. Boto and another officer entered cautiously, still unsure if a burglar might be inside. The library downstairs was ransacked, but the rest of the lower floor looked untouched. Upstairs, the first bedroom was clearly a girl's. Clothes dumped from the closet, stuffed animals strewn across the floor. The next room, likely Andreas's, was neat, a model airplane hanging from the ceiling. The third room was the master bedroom. On the bed lay a man with a gun near his arm, his face covered. Boto pulled back the sheets and found a second body, a woman. The scene told him this was no robbery. Outside, the officers decided not to tell the teenagers what they had found immediately. Around 4:30 a.m., Daniel's family arrived, embracing Suzanne and Andreas. Boto asked Daniel to inform them. Daniel pulled them close, whispering the news. Andreas stepped away, appearing dazed. Suzanne turned to Boto. "What do I do now?" she asked. By 5 a.m., the house was swarming with reporters. Daniel's father, Astrogildo, gave statements to the media while Suzanne and Andreas were taken to the station. There, her behavior drew even more attention. While Andreas sat small and silent in his chair, his sister leaned against Daniel, dozing. In between giving her statement, she kissed him, held his hand, and smiled. At one point, she looked at the police chief and said, almost casually, "I would like you to kill and torture these people that killed my parents." Then she turned and smiled at Daniel. Tears for the camera. From the very beginning, investigators doubted the story they had been given. The robbery and murder explanation looked wrong, too neat, too careless in its details. Jewelry, cash, and weapons had been left behind. The crime scene felt staged. Their focus quickly narrowed to those closest to the victims: the children, the family's maid, Manfred's colleagues at Dersa, and Marísia's patients. Suzanne's relationship with Daniel Cravinhos drew particular attention. Friends confirmed what police had already begun to suspect, that Manfred and Marísia had disapproved from the start, and that Marísia had once pressured her daughter to end it. On November 4th, 2002, 4 days after the murders, Suzanne returned to the Homicide and Personal Protection Department for a second statement. The interrogation, meant to clarify inconsistencies, lasted about 2 hours. The break came when investigators learned that Christian Cravinhos had purchased a new motorcycle only days after the murders. He was taken into custody while Daniel was being questioned. 4 days later, on November 8, 2002, the facade cracked. Christian, Daniel, and Suzanne all confessed to killing Manfred and Marísia von Richthofen. Years later, in 2006, Suzanne's image became the center of another controversy, this time not in a police station, but on national television. TV Globo's Fantastico had spent 9 months negotiating with her lawyer and legal guardian, Danivaldo Barney, for an exclusive interview. 2 off-camera meetings and a phone conversation preceded the final agreement. Barney insisted on one condition: no archive footage of Suzane was to be shown. On April 5, 2006, the Fantastico team met Suzanne at Barney's apartment in Morumbi. She was 22 but styled to look younger, bunny slippers on her feet, a Minnie Mouse t-shirt, bangs falling into her eyes. She opened with the family photographs, flipping through them like a teenager at a sleepover. When asked about Daniel, she didn't answer directly. Instead, she glanced at Barney, who prompted her. "A lot of hatred," she said finally. "He destroyed my family, the most precious thing I had." The cameras, already rolling, caught a moment not meant for broadcast. Barney was overheard telling Suzanne to cry during the interview. When the segment aired on April 9th, Fantastico framed it as a performance, a calculated attempt by her defense to reshape her public image. Suzanne appeared as a naive, childlike figure, easily influenced, perhaps incapable of independent malice. The next day, she was arrested again, because her release could influence or hinder the upcoming trial. Barney maintained a different version. He said he'd told Suzanne to cry only to soften her brother, Andreas, who was locked in a legal battle against her. Under Brazilian law, an heir who attempts to kill the benefactor can be excluded from inheritance. Andreas had filed exactly such an action, determined that his sister would not profit from their parents' deaths. For Barney, the tears were strategy, not for the jury, but for the blood relative she had once called her closest friend. The first attempt to bring the von Richthofen case to trial collapsed before it even began. On June 5, 2006, the Cravinhos brothers arrived at the courthouse an hour before the scheduled start time. Suzanne came shortly after. But the brothers' lawyers refused to appear, claiming they hadn't had enough time to meet with their clients. Their trial was canceled on the spot. Then, after a heated exchange with the judge over an absent witness, Suzanne's own lawyers walked out. Her trial was postponed too. The delays didn't last. The court moved quickly to prevent another derailment, ensuring that the brothers would have access to counsel, even appointing backup defenders if needed. Suzanne, no longer under house arrest, was considered less of a risk for last-minute maneuvers. A new date was set, July 17, 2006. From the start, the trial was a battlefield of conflicting stories. Taking the stand, Suzane denied knowing about the murder plot, claiming she had been very high the night of the killings and only realized what had happened when she came home with Andreas. She painted Daniel as controlling, jealous to the point of obsession, and said she'd been the golden goose of the Cravinhos family, funding his luxuries with her parents' money. Christian, in his turn, claimed Daniel alone had killed both Manfred and Marísia, though he admitted he'd taken the blame initially to spare his brother. He accused Suzanne of being the one to say, "I want to kill my parents today." Daniel countered with his own accusation. Suzanne was the mastermind, motivated by conflict with her parents and the inheritance. By the end of the day, the defense had asked for, and been granted, a face-to-face meeting between the 3 defendants. The tension was palpable. Andreas was the first witness. Calm but resolute, he denied Daniel's claims of abuse in their household and rejected Suzane's version of events. He admitted to being pressured into writing a forgiveness note and said he felt threatened by his sister. You can expect anything from a person like that. Police Chief Cynthia Tucundava Gomes dismantled the brothers' claim that only one of them had delivered the fatal blows, insisting the attacks were simultaneous. She described Suzane's composure after her arrest, brushing her hair and asking her boyfriend if she looked pretty before her booking photo. Other witnesses painted contrasting pictures. Some spoke of the brothers' good behavior in prison. Others recalled Suzanne's cruelty toward her mother. Emotions ran high. Daniel Cravinhos, the brothers' mother, tearfully defended her sons while accusing the von Richthofens of being abusive and aggressive. Her testimony seemed to sway Christian, who abruptly changed his story, now confessing to killing Marísia but claiming Suzanne had engineered the plan. A former college classmate of Suzanne's testified to her isolation, the lies she told to meet Daniel, and his obsessive jealousy. She also said Suzanne once claimed Daniel was haunted by the spirit of a friend. The day began with forensic photographs, images so graphic that some in the courtroom turned away. Experts described Marísia's prolonged death from repeated blows to the head. The defendants kept their backs to the screen. The jury also saw the filmed reenactment of the murders. Daniel and Christian cried openly. Suzanne did not. Love letters between her and Daniel were read aloud, causing her visible discomfort and laughter from the gallery. For prosecutor Roberto Tardelli, the moment underscored her coldness and Daniel's lack of control. The final day was for closing arguments. The defense tried to strip away aggravating factors, portraying Christian's role as limited and Daniel's as less cruel than alleged. The prosecution pushed back hard, accusing Suzane's lawyers of playing on class prejudice by claiming she was an innocent rich girl manipulated by a poorer, criminally inclined boyfriend. During prosecutor Nadir de Campos Jr.'s accusations, Daniel broke down in tears and had to be removed with Christian. Suzanne sat quietly, head bowed. That night, the jury, 4 men and 3 women, deliberated behind closed doors at the Barra Funda courthouse. They answered 12 questions for each defendant, weighing motive, cruelty, the victim's ability to defend themselves, and whether Suzanne had acted under duress. In the early hours of July 22nd, Judge Alberto Anderson Filho read the verdict. The questions were answered. The fates of Suzane, Daniel, and Christian were sealed. The verdict. The jury's verdict came in the early hours of July 22nd, 2006. After a week-long trial, Judge Alberto Anderson Filho read the sentences. 39 years and 6 months each for Suzanne von Richthofen and Daniel Cravinhos, and 38 years and 6 months for Christian. All 3 were convicted for the murders of Manfred and Marísia von Richthofen, killed in their Brooklyn home on October 31, 2002. The penalties were calculated with base sentences, aggravating factors, and small reductions. Suzanne for being under 21 at the time, Daniel and Christian for confessing. Under Brazilian law, however, none could serve more than 30 years. The road from sentencing to eventual release was marked by shifting prison regimes and repeated controversies. Initially, Suzanne was housed alone at the Carandiru Women's Penitentiary, while Daniel and Christian were sent to separate men's facilities. Her early bids for release failed, but in 2005 she briefly won habeas corpus, only to be sent back in April 2006 after televised interviews, which prosecutors claimed were part of a staged defense strategy. By 2013, Daniel and Christian moved to a semi-open regime, able to work by day and return to prison at night. Suzanne followed in 2014, but soon asked to remain in a closed regime, citing fear of harassment and wanting to keep her paid prison workshop job. She eventually moved into the semi-open system, receiving work release privileges and temporary holiday leaves, though she continued living at Tremembe by choice. In 2016, a misstep cost her that progress. Authorities claimed she had provided a false address during Mother's Day leave. She was found at her boyfriend's sister's property, not the location she'd reported. The courts deemed it a serious infraction, sending her back to a closed regime. Years later, in January 2023, the São Paulo Court of Justice granted Suzane the open regime, noting she had met the legal requirements and earned significant sentence reductions through prison work. Her term, once 39 years, now stood at 34 years and 4 months. The public prosecutor's office vowed to appeal, requesting new psychological evaluations. But for the first time in 2 decades, Suzane's path toward full freedom was formally within reach. The von Richthofen estate, valued at over 11 million reais, became a shadowy subplot to the already notorious case. Allegations swirled that shortly after Suzane's 18th birthday in 2001, her father had opened a 30 million euro account in Switzerland in her name. Money, some claimed, came from corruption tied to his work at Dursa, where he oversaw part of the billion-dollar Mario Covas Ring Road project. Nothing on paper would have prevented her from accessing it after serving her sentence. In 2015, her brother Andreas broke years of silence to, quote, defend their father against these accusations. In a pointed letter to prosecutor Nadir de Campos Jr., he demanded proof or a public retraction, calling the rumors baseless and cruel to their parents' memory. His anger toward the killers, including his sister, was clear. "It's disgusting," he wrote. The courts formally barred Suzane from inheriting in 2011, deeming her unworthy due to her conviction. She even sought alimony from the estate but was denied. In 2014, she signed away her share to Andreas, saying she wished to see him again, though they hadn't met since 2006, and cut ties with her longtime lawyer, barring him from further visits. In 2015, the court confirmed Andreas as sole heir, giving him full control over the family's remaining assets, including their former Brooklyn home, valued at about 3 million reais. More than 2 decades after that October night, the von Richthofen case remains etched into Brazil's collective memory, not just for its brutality, but for the layers of betrayal, privilege, and rumor that followed. The trials ended, the sentences were handed down, and the inheritance disputes resolved. Yet the story never truly faded. For Andreas, the sole surviving member of the immediate family, the years brought distance and silence. For Suzane, they brought prison, release, and a life rebuilt under a new name. The mansion in Brooklyn stands only in photographs now, its lights long extinguished, but the case continues to cast a long shadow, a reminder of how quickly a family's image of perfection can unravel and how some wounds never fully close.